The letter was sitting on my porch when I got home from work, neatly folded inside one of those stiff white HOA envelopes. I already knew it wasn't going to be good news. Every time one of those showed up, it meant trouble. But this one? This one took things to a new level. It read, "You are hereby fined $150 for violating HOA noise regulations. Your wind chimes constitute a nuisance to the community and must be removed immediately." I stared at the paper, almost laughing. My wind chimes. A nuisance? Out of all the barking dogs, noisy lawnmowers, and late-night parties, this neighborhood endured, somehow. My small wind chimes were the great offense. Those chimes weren't just decoration. They were a gift from my grandmother before she passed. She always said, every time you hear them sing, think of it as me saying hello. So when the wind blew gently at night and the sound drifted through the porch, it wasn't noise. Was comfort. It was her. But the HOA president, Karen, knew the type wasn't about to let me enjoy that peace. She had been looking for reasons to nitpick ever since I moved in. First, it was my mailbox not being the approved shade of white. Then, it was how I parked my truck in my own driveway. And now, apparently, my crime was hanging wind chimes. I figured it had to be some kind of mistake. So, I decided to call Karen directly. She answered with that smug tone she always carried. Like she was queen of the block. "Hi Karen, it's Mark. I just got a letter about my wind chimes." "That's got to be a mistake." "Not a mistake," she cut in. "Several neighbors have complained about them. They're disruptive, and they don't meet the HOA's standards. You'll need to remove them immediately or face additional fines." I took a breath, trying to stay calm. "Karen, those chimes aren't loud. They're barely audible unless you're standing on my porch." "They're a disturbance," she snapped. "The HOA rules are very clear." That was her go-to phrase. Anytime she wanted her way, the HOA rules are very clear. But here's the thing, she always conveniently interpreted them however she liked. I wasn't about to take them down. Not without a fight. Over the next week, I left my wind chimes, hanging proudly. And sure enough, the fines started piling up. First $150, then another $150, then $300. Karen seemed to think if she buried me in penalties, I'd eventually give in, but something strange started happening. As I walked around the neighborhood, people would stop me quietly. "Hey Mark." One neighbor whispered, "I like your wind chimes. Don't let them bully you." Another said, "Honestly, I wish I had some too. They're calming." It turned out no one actually cared about my chimes, at least. No one except Karen. She was using the HOA as her personal weapon to enforce her own taste. That's when the idea first sparked. What if my one little wind chime wasn't alone? What if the whole neighborhood joined in? At first, it sounded crazy, but the more Karen pushed, the more determined I became. And so, I started planning. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee on the porch and listened to the soft notes of my grandmother's wind chimes, I couldn't shake the idea. What if I wasn't the only one? What if there were a dozen, 24 chimes across the neighborhood? Karen couldn't single me out, then she'd have to fine everyone. And that wouldn't sit well with the board or the residents. So I started small. I walked next door to talk to my neighbor, Mrs. Green. She was in her late 60s, loved gardening, and had always admired my chimes whenever she came by. I told her what Karen had been doing. "You're kidding me?" she said, shaking her head. "Fined for wind chimes. What's next? Bird feeders." "I'm thinking about getting more people to hang some," I told her carefully. "To cause trouble, but to make a point." Mrs. Green's eyes lit up. "Say no more. I've got a set my daughter gave me years ago. Been sitting in the garage. I'll hang them tonight." That was one ally down. Over the next few days, I had quiet conversations with a handful of neighbors. Some were hesitant at first now. One wanted to get on Karen's bad side. She had a reputation for being ruthless with violations, and the HOA had fined people for the smallest things: a flower pot in the wrong color, curtains that clashed with the community aesthetic, even someone's Christmas lights for being too bright. But once I explained how she was targeting me over something so harmless, most of them got angry. And when I told them Karen was lying about several neighbors complaining, they were even more willing to help. By the end of the week, I counted 8 houses with wind chimes hanging proudly. Different sizes, different tones, some high and tinkling, some deep and mellow. At night, when the breeze rolled through, it sounded like a choir. And sure enough, Karen noticed the next HOA letter didn't just come to MI, went to everyone. She called the chimes an organized noise disturbance and warned that the HOA would begin issuing collective fines. That backfired spectacularly. People who had never spoken up against her before suddenly found themselves on my side. Mrs. Green marched over to my porch with her letter in hand and declared, "She's gone too far this time." I laughed, but I knew Karen wasn't going to back down easily. She thrived on control, and now it was slipping, so I dug deeper. I pulled up the HOA's bylaws online, combing through the pages late at night. That's when I found something important. The HOA had no jurisdiction over noise levels unless they exceeded the city's ordinance. And the city ordinance specifically stated that wind chimes were permitted, as long as they weren't amplified or deliberately disruptive. Karen was bluffing. I printed out the ordinance and highlighted the sections. The next morning, I walked around the neighborhood, handing copies to everyone who had joined the movement. They smiled when they read it, their confidence growing. We weren't breaking any rules. We were perfectly within our rights. And suddenly, Karen's threats didn't carry the same weight. That's when I realized this wasn't just about wind chimes anymore. This was about standing up to someone who had bullied us all for years. And the best way to deal with a bully is to take away their power. Karen wasn't used to losing control. The moment she realized people weren't caving to her letters, she escalated. Within a week, she called for an emergency HOA board meeting. Every resident received an email that sounded more like a war declaration than an invitation. Due to multiple violations of community standards regarding disruptive noise, the board will be addressing corrective actions at the upcoming HOA meeting. Attendance is mandatory. Mandatory. That word alone made people furious. Many of my neighbors who usually avoided HOA meetings like the plague told me they were going just to watch the fireworks. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. People were standing along the walls because there weren't enough chairs. The hum of conversation filled the air, and it was clear everyone was there to hear Karen explain why she was suddenly trying to ban wind chimes from the neighborhood. She sat at the head of the table, gavel in hand, her face red and tight like she was already prepared for battle. "As you all know," she began, "we have a serious problem in this community. Several residents have installed wind chimes that are creating disruptive noise, disturbing the peace and lowering property values. The board has decided that effective immediately, wind chimes will be prohibited." The room erupted with voices. People were shouting, "That's ridiculous, and you can't do that." I saw Mrs. Green stand up, holding a copy of the city ordinance I had given her. "You're lying, Karen," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the noise. "There's nothing in the bylaws about wind chimes, and city law says they're allowed." She waved the paper in the air. "You can't just make up rules because you don't like the sound." The crowd cheered. For the first time, Karen looked rattled. She banged the gavel. "Order, order. The board has the authority." "No," I said, standing up from the back of the room. Everyone turned as I walked forward, my own copy of the ordinance in hand. The HOA can't override city ordinances. That's not how it works. You don't have that authority. Karen's eyes narrowed. "You're undermining this board." You're deliberately creating disturbances and encouraging others to do the same. That's grounds for legal action." "Legal action," said, smiling. "Then you'd better be ready to take the entire neighborhood to court." "Because it's not just me anymore, Karen. It's all of us." There was an uproar of applause, and several neighbors stood up beside me. For the first time, Karen realized she wasn't dealing with one homeowner she could bully into submission. She was facing an entire community, but Karen wasn't going to give up that easily. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with venom. "Fine. If you all want to play games, then I'll make sure the HOA budget reflects the cost of constant enforcement. And when your fees go up, don't come crying to me." That's when I dropped the real bombshell. "You might want to be careful about where you're spending that budget," I said slowly, because I've been reviewing HOA financial records. I pulled a small stack of papers from my folder. And unless I'm mistaken, there are some irregularities in how funds have been allocated. The room went dead silent. Karen's face went pale. She slammed the gavel again, but her hand shook this time. That's irrelevant to this discussion." "No, Karen," I said firmly. "It's very relevant, because if you're threatening to raise fees over something that isn't even enforceable, then the residents deserve to know where their money is really going." The murmurs started again, louder this time. People were whispering, asking questions, glaring at Karen. That's when I knew I had her cornered. Karen didn't sleep on it. The very next morning, she went door to door with a clipboard in hand, demanding signatures for a petition to ban wind chimes. I later found out she'd been scribbling down names of people who never even answered their doors, claiming they agreed with her. Classic Karen behavior, cheating her own system to look powerful. But by then, things had already taken on a life of their own. What started as a couple of wind chimes had grown into something bigger. Kids down the block had started banging on old pots and pans in rhythm at sunset, laughing as their parents clapped along. A retired music teacher brought out his violin and played along with the sounds of the chimes. Even Mr. Rivera, who hadn't talked to anyone in years, pulled out his guitar and started strumming with a smile. It wasn't noise, it was music soon. Every evening, people were gathering in there. Yards with whatever they had. Drums, tambourines, flutes, even buckets filled with beans to shake like maracas. It turned into a neighborhood orchestra. People laughed, neighbors bonded, and for once, it felt like a real community instead of a bunch of strangers living next to each other. And Karen hated it. She marched outside one night with her phone, screaming that she was calling the police. "This is unlawful assembly. You're disturbing the peace. You're all going to get fined." The funny thing, when the police showed up, they didn't shut us down. One officer stood there listening, then cracked a smile. "You all sound pretty good. Better than most concerts I've paid to see." Karen nearly choked on her rage. She tried to argue, waving her petition, but the officer cut her off. "Ma'am, unless they're breaking noise ordinances, which they're not, you can't stop them. If anything, it looks like your community is finally enjoying itself." Neighbors cheered again, and Karen stomped back inside, slamming her door so hard you could hear it from 3 houses down. That night was when I realized we had shifted the balance. It wasn't me against Karen anymore. It wasn't even just about wind chimes. It was about neighbors standing up against someone who thrived on control. The more Karen pushed, the stronger the neighborhood orchestra grew. Someone even printed flyers calling our evening jam sessions Symphony of the Block and taped them to mailboxes. People brought out lawn chairs, snacks, and drinks, turning it into a nightly event. Karen's power was slipping fast, and she knew it. That's when she made her most desperate move, yet she tried to threaten the HOA into suing me personally for inciting rebellion. What she didn't realize was that by then, I had already collected everything I needed to turn her own tricks against her. Karen went all in on her last desperate move. She stormed into the HOA office, demanded an emergency meeting, and accused me of inciting rebellion against HOA authority. According to her, the orchestra wasn't music hit, was an organized uprising. She tried to fine me thousands of dollars, claiming the gatherings were my responsibility. But this time, she made a fatal mistake. Because while she was screaming about rules, I calmly pulled out the HOA bylaws, the very document she'd been abusing for years. And wouldn't you know it, the rules actually protected reasonable cultural and community gatherings on personal property. Not only was the orchestra legal, but it was also explicitly shielded from the nonsense she was trying to push. Even better, I had signatures from over 30 households showing their support for the orchestra. Families, veterans, retirees, kids, everyone was represented. It wasn't just me anymore. It was the entire neighborhood. When I presented everything to the board, they froze. For years, they'd let Karen bully people because she barked the loudest. But now, for the first time, they saw the whole neighborhood united against her. One board member finally spoke up. "Karen, you've overstepped." Again, this stops here. The look on her face was priceless. She tried to argue, but the board turned on her. They stripped her of her special enforcement privileges and even moved to censure her for misusing HOA funds to push her. Personal vendettas, Karen was speechless. For the first time, she had no power. That night, the neighborhood orchestra gathered again, stronger than ever. People showed up with new instruments. Kids painted a big banner that said "Community over Control," and even the HOA board members came out to listen. The music wasn't just sound anymore, it was freedom. It was proof that when neighbors stood together, no Karen could divide them. And as for me, I sat back in my rocking chair, wind chimes swaying in the breeze, listening to the laughter and the rhythm of the orchestra filling the night air. Karen never came outside again during our gatherings. Maybe she realized her time as the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood was over. Sometimes the smallest things like a set of wind chimes can become the biggest battles. But the lesson here is simple. Bullies only win when people stay silent. When neighbors unite, when communities come together, even the loudest Karen can't silence the music of togetherness. And in our neighborhood, that music plays on every single night.